People think divorce is a loud explosion. Actually, it is a slow cave-in that buries you under the foundation you spent your youth building. My husband entered mediation smiling like a hunter, confident he would steal my life's work. I braced for a soul-crushing bloodbath until my father leaned over and whispered 3 words. Then I realized the best way to destroy a greedy man is to smile and personally hand him a poisoned crown. Hello, dear listeners of the Vivian Revenge Stories channel. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with 0 budget to keep operating. If you find today's story engaging, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking team to cover their living expenses and continue creating stories for you. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the PayPal link in the video description or comments. My name is Faith Berry. I am 36 years old, and I am sitting directly across from Julian, my husband of 10 years, inside a cold, pristine glass conference room that overlooks the bustling financial district of Chicago. The sprawling city below moves on with perfect rhythm, completely indifferent to the fact that my entire world is being violently dismantled floor by floor. Julian looks immaculate. He is wearing an incredibly expensive, custom-tailored suit that hugs his shoulders perfectly, presenting a demeanor of sickening calmness. He sits there like a seasoned predator who has finally backed his exhausted prey into a dead end. Right beside him, his aggressive attorney is enthusiastically laying out a massive stack of documents. These papers contain demands so incredibly absurd they feel like a terrible joke. Julian wants the luxury downtown penthouse. He wants 80% of the controlling shares in Ethelgard Synthetics, the revolutionary biomaterials company that I founded and built with my own bare hands. He is even demanding full custody of our golden retriever, a sweet dog he has actively ignored since the very first day we brought him home. Lurking just behind Julian, acting as his personal cheering section, sits his family. His mother and sister continually roll their eyes with undisguised disdain, whispering back and forth with nasty, triumphant smirks on their faces. In their elitist minds, I have always been nothing more than an eccentric, socially awkward weirdo who somehow got miraculously lucky to latch onto their brilliant son. They truly believe Julian is a diplomatic genius who single-handedly sculpted my commercial empire. His lawyer simply will not stop talking. The man continuously hurls heavily fabricated accusations across the polished mahogany table, aggressively painting me as a paranoid, deeply unstable wife who severely neglected her family. Worse, he firmly insists on the official record that I made absolutely 0 contributions to the commercial development of my own company. My chest tightens until breathing becomes a sharp physical pain. My hands tightly grip my thick stack of printed rebuttals, preparing to unleash hell. I brace every muscle in my body, fully preparing for the most financially draining, emotionally exhausting, and bloodiest legal battle of my entire life. Suddenly, my father, a quiet, retired mechanical engineer who has been sitting silently by my side all morning, leans over. He does not look angry or distressed. He is entirely calm. He leans close to my ear and casually whispers, "Give him everything." I whip my head around to stare at my dad, utterly stunned, but his steady, unwavering eyes hold a quiet, terrifying clarity that instantly anchors my racing heart. I take one slow, deep breath. I turn my gaze back to my own lawyer, and I slowly, deliberately nod my head. For the very first time today, the smug, untouchable arrogance completely vanishes from Julian's face, instantly replaced by a stark, beautiful flash of absolute confusion. I remember the absolute beginning of Ethelgard Synthetics. It was not born in a sleek corporate boardroom. It was forged in a cramped, poorly ventilated laboratory on the industrial edge of town. I spent thousands of hours hunched over scanning electron microscopes and synthetic fiber looms. My hands were heavily calloused, my eyes chronically bloodshot from severe lack of sleep. I was driven by a singular consuming obsession to synthesize a truly revolutionary fire-resistant biomaterial. There were hundreds of failed iterations, days where I wept from sheer frustration. When the formula finally stabilized, changing the molecular structure of protective fabrics forever, it was a profound triumph born purely from my own grit, sweat, and intellect. But a scientific breakthrough, no matter how brilliant, desperately needs a megaphone to reach the masses. Julian possessed a natural, undeniably magnetic charisma. He had the sharp jawline, the perfectly tailored suits even back then, and a silver tongue that could effortlessly sell ice to a blizzard. It made perfect logical sense at the time for him to step up as the chief executive officer. He naturally became the polished, glowing face of the company. I genuinely preferred the quiet, predictable hum of the research and development floor over the exhausting theatrics of investor meetings. I was perfectly content taking the title of Director of Research, voluntarily stepping behind the heavy velvet curtain so my husband could shine brightly on the main stage. However, as the company rapidly expanded and our annual revenue skyrocketed into the millions of dollars, the dynamic subtly but aggressively shifted. The spotlight has a funny way of blinding the person standing directly in it. Julian began to deeply believe his own marketing copy. When prestigious business magazines and financial networks came calling for exclusive interviews, he slowly stopped mentioning my name entirely. The public narrative drastically morphed. Suddenly, he was not just the brilliant business manager, he was the sole visionary. He publicly claimed the title of the mastermind behind our core patents. I would sit alone in my office, reading glowing editorial profiles where he casually referred to my grueling scientific breakthroughs as his own brilliant midnight epiphanies. He stole my genius and wore it like a cheap designer coat. This escalating delusion was eagerly and constantly fed by his family. They served as the persistent, dripping poison in his ear. They had always viewed me as entirely too plain, far too obsessed with raw data, and drastically lacking the superficial glamour required for high society. As Julian's social status elevated into the exclusive realm of an elite entrepreneur, they constantly reminded him that I was a dull, mismatched accessory. They convinced him that a man of his incredible stature deserved a vibrant partner who commanded the room, not a quiet woman who vastly preferred the company of glass beakers and complex patent filings. Sunday family dinners gradually transformed into a quiet, excruciating psychological torture chamber. I became the frequent target of their sophisticated, passive-aggressive mockery. "Oh, Faith is just handling the messy tech chores," his mother would say with a tight, dismissive smile, swirling her expensive red wine in her crystal glass. "Leave the real empire building to Julian. He has the heavy lifting to do." They cruelly relegated my entire life's work to the status of a cute little hobby, while they worshipped Julian as a conquering, flawless king. He never once corrected them. In fact, he would just smile and bask lazily in their blind adoration, leaving me utterly stranded and isolated at the far end of the long dining table. The obvious question is why I stayed silent for so long. Why did I actively let them erase my identity? The truth is deeply rooted in a fundamental flaw of my own making. I deeply believed that a successful marriage was fundamentally built on silent sacrifice and endless compromise. I convinced myself that my professional ego was entirely secondary to the stability of our household. More importantly, I looked at our sweet 8-year-old son, Leo. He had my quiet, observant nature and Julian's bright, charming smile. I was absolutely terrified of shattering his innocent, happy world. I desperately wanted to protect his childhood peace, fiercely shielding him from the ugly, toxic resentment that was silently brewing between his parents. I swallowed my pride, piece by bitter piece, day after long day, deliberately choosing the fragile illusion of a happy home over my own professional dignity. I thought I was being a devoted wife and a fiercely protective mother. I did not realize I was simply teaching a greedy narcissist that my boundaries did not exist. The revelation did not arrive through a careless smudge of bright lipstick on a shirt collar or a cliché, late-night romantic text message illuminating a dark bedroom. My world shattered in the freezing, hyper-sterile environment of our main corporate server room at 2 o'clock in the morning. I had driven alone to the silent, empty headquarters because a critical diagnostic warning had pinged my phone. I needed to manually patch a sudden, complex vulnerability in our proprietary local intranet framework. The massive building was completely dark, silent except for the rhythmic, heavy mechanical hum of the industrial cooling units keeping the databanks alive. While running a routine system diagnostic scan across the main network hub, my administrative override protocol flagged a massive, highly unusual anomaly. There was an incredibly heavy data partition cleverly masked behind a series of intricate dummy firewalls. Julian was a brilliant, silver-tongued talker, but he was certainly no software engineer. He had relied on standard, expensive commercial encryption programs, completely forgetting one fundamental, fatal detail. I was the person who literally coded the entire backbone of Ethelgard Synthetics' digital security infrastructure from scratch. It took me exactly 20 minutes of furious, focused typing to crack his hidden, private directory wide open. What I found inside hit my chest with the kinetic, devastating force of a speeding freight train. It was not amateur pornography. It was not secret offshore bank accounts. It was hundreds of highly classified, meticulously organized blueprints and schematics. I saw the exact, painstaking chemical structures and the proprietary heat resistance metrics of our next-generation biomaterial fabric, all neatly zipped into stealthy, easily exportable data packets. My husband had been systematically, ruthlessly, funneling the absolute lifeblood of my life work to Apex Dynamics, our largest and most aggressive commercial rival. But the toxic venom dripping from this discovery cut so much deeper than simple corporate espionage. My hands trembled violently as I clicked open a hidden, encrypted email chain attached directly to the data dumps. The primary recipient on the other end was Eleanor Vance. She was the viciously ambitious head of legal affairs over at Apex Dynamics. I knew exactly who this woman was. She was a highly prominent, wildly wealthy socialite, the sole aristocratic heiress to a massive global shipping fortune. She was also the very same polished, absolutely perfect woman my mother-in-law had been constantly, aggressively inviting to their elite, private charity galas over the past 2 years. The sickening puzzle pieces instantly snapped together with terrifying, blinding clarity. For 2 entire years, Julian had been cultivating a secret, torrid affair with this powerful heiress. It was a deeply calculated, strategic betrayal actively orchestrated and gleefully blessed by his own elitist family. They had finally found the glamorous, wealthy trophy wife they always genuinely believed he deserved, and they had quietly, patiently, served me up for the ultimate slaughter. The absolute final nail in my coffin was a compressed audio file hidden deep within a nested subfolder, innocently labeled as a routine quarterly strategy sync. I plugged in my heavy studio headphones, took a ragged, shaky breath, and pressed play. It was a secretly recorded video conference between Julian and Eleanor. "Do not worry about the intellectual property transfer, darling." Julian's voice purred smoothly through the digital speakers, dripping with a disgusting, sickeningly relaxed arrogance. "I am securing the core patents under my separate shell entity as we speak. Consider it my billion-dollar dowry for our upcoming wedding." Eleanor's sharp, highly cultured laugh echoed back through the audio feed. "And what about the original architect? Will your wife just quietly step aside and let you take the crown?" "Faith?" Julian snorted loudly, the sheer, unfiltered contempt in his voice vibrating sharply against my eardrums. "She is just a dummy bookworm, a glorified lab rat who got incredibly lucky. The moment I threaten her with a massive, highly publicized divorce, she will completely panic. She does not have the stomach for a real, vicious legal fight. She will surrender absolutely everything just to keep the peace and scurry right back to her little test tubes." The audio track abruptly ended, leaving only the deafening white noise of the server room cooling fans. I stood entirely frozen in the exact center of the chilled room, staring blankly at the glowing blue light of the monitor. My blood turned to absolute freezing ice. For 10 long years, I had bent over backwards. I had constantly compromised, accommodated every single unreasonable demand, and swallowed my own professional pride entirely to keep our family intact. I genuinely, foolishly, thought I was nurturing a loving partnership through profound patience and unwavering kindness. But standing right there, surrounded by towering steel racks of blinking servers, the brutal, blinding reality finally set in. My infinite patience had never once commanded his respect. To him, my kindness was nothing but a glaring, pathetic vulnerability. My willingness to compromise was just a profound stupidity waiting to be ruthlessly drained dry. The naive, devoted wife he thought he knew died right there on the cold linoleum floor. What quietly rose in her place in the freezing silence was something entirely different, a sharply focused, terrifyingly logical entity forged from the exact same indestructible, fire-resistant material I had invented. Most people, upon discovering such an earth-shattering, soul-crushing betrayal, would immediately scream. They would dramatically smash the expensive computer monitors, hurl heavy keyboards across the room, or immediately call their spouse in a hysterical, blinding rage. I did absolutely none of those things. A strictly scientific mind is rigorously trained to observe the environment, isolate the volatile variables, and systematically engineer a permanent solution to the problem. I stood in the freezing server room and took one deep, steadying breath that tasted faintly of ozone and filtered industrial air. My trembling hands completely stopped shaking. I calmly reached into my bag and plugged my encrypted, high-capacity external hard drive directly into the primary mainframe port. It took exactly 45 minutes to meticulously mirror the entire restricted network drive, flawlessly capturing every single hidden email, every secret audio file, and every illegally compromised chemical blueprint. I safely ejected the small drive, slipped it silently into my winter coat pocket, locked the server terminal, and simply walked out of the building. I drove home through the quiet, pre-dawn streets of Chicago with the absolute, chilling focus of a trauma surgeon calmly preparing for a highly complex amputation. When I slid back into bed next to Julian, he shifted slightly in his sleep, completely unaware that the quiet woman lying beside him was no longer his naive victim, but his meticulous executioner. The very next morning, I began secretly assembling my covert strike team. I deliberately avoided the flashy, heavily advertised corporate law firms in the downtown district. Instead, I quietly sought out a highly exclusive boutique intelligence firm masquerading as an intellectual property law office. I hired a brilliantly ruthless lead attorney and paired her with 3 of the most aggressive, sharp-toothed forensic accountants in the entire state of Illinois. These were highly specialized professionals who charged $800 an hour to mercilessly dissect offshore tax havens and complex corporate fraud. I handed them my encrypted drive and gave them one very simple, clear directive. I told them to map every single marital asset, trace every stolen document to its ultimate destination, and find the catastrophic structural weaknesses in Julian's fragile empire. They worked entirely in the shadows, communicating with me strictly through highly secured, untraceable digital channels. While the accountants aggressively dug into the corporate ledgers, I confidently returned to my true domain, the precise and unforgiving realm of chemistry and molecular structures. Julian was actively and proudly peddling our flagship fire-resistant formula to Eleanor and her massive rival corporation, genuinely believing he held the absolute keys to the kingdom. But Julian only understood superficial profit margins and flashy marketing presentations. He completely lacked any fundamental comprehension of chemical logistics. He did not realize that the primary synthetic binding agent, which was absolutely essential to our current formula, was sourced exclusively from a highly specialized manufacturing plant located in Ohio. I had recently been reviewing deeply buried, highly confidential internal safety reports from that exact supplier. They were systematically dumping highly toxic, non-biodegradable chemical runoff directly into the local municipal water supply. It was strictly a matter of time before the federal government stepped in. I quietly tipped off a senior contact at the Environmental Protection Agency. I knew with absolute scientific certainty that within a few short months, that supplier would face a massive federal raid, instantly paralyzing the entire supply chain. The glorious billion-dollar formula Julian was arrogantly promising to his wealthy new mistress was effectively a ticking time bomb, utterly useless without that specific, soon-to-be illegal chemical binder. Knowing the original formula was completely doomed, I desperately needed a flawless, revolutionary replacement. For the next 6 consecutive months, I lived a grueling, highly compartmentalized double life. During the day, I played the familiar role of the docile, obedient research director at Ethelgard Synthetics. But late at night, under the cover of absolute secrecy, I leased a small, discreet, independent laboratory situated on the desolate outskirts of the city, paying the monthly rent entirely in untraceable cash. I spent countless, exhausting hours engineering an entirely new biomaterial. This was Generation 2.0. It was 30% lighter, completely environmentally sustainable, and boasted double the thermal resistance of the original synthetic fabric. It was an absolute masterpiece of modern material science. Through my aggressive legal team, I successfully registered this revolutionary patent under a totally independent, deeply layered shell corporation. It was an airtight, perfectly constructed legal entity, completely decoupled from my marital assets and entirely out of Julian's greedy reach. Simultaneously, I began the meticulous, surgical manipulation of our shared company finances. As the chief research officer, I possessed top-tier administrative clearance across all company databases. Over those same 6 months, I subtly restructured our primary vendor agreements. I quietly and legally shifted all the high-risk developmental contracts, the heavily leveraged, unsecured corporate loans, and the severely problematic supply chain liabilities directly under Julian's exclusive executive portfolio. I drafted complex legal addendums, ensuring his digital executive signature was securely and permanently attached to every single toxic asset and impending catastrophic debt. I was carefully building an invisible, inescapable cage of total financial ruin right around him. He was far too busy planning his glamorous future with his wealthy mistress, attending expensive charity galas and tasting wedding cakes, to notice the heavy iron bars silently closing in on him. The absolute most challenging aspect of this entire clandestine operation was stepping through the front door of our home every single evening. The exact moment my hand touched the cold brass doorknob, the cold, calculating corporate assassin had to instantly vanish. I had to become just a mother. My beautiful 8-year-old son, Leo, absolutely deserved a warm sanctuary completely untouched by the ugly, vicious economic war his parents were silently waging. I spent hours sitting on the living room carpet, helping him build towering, colorful spaceships out of plastic blocks. We baked fresh chocolate chip cookies from scratch on Sunday afternoons, and I patiently read him 3 bedtime stories every single night without fail. I laughed at his silly jokes, helped him with his math homework, and kissed his forehead gently while he slept. I maintained a flawless, impenetrable boundary between my absolute, calculated vengeance and his precious childhood innocence. Julian would occasionally breeze through the house in his expensive suits, carelessly patting Leo on the head before rushing off to his secret hotel rendezvous, entirely convinced that I was just a naive domestic fool. He had absolutely no idea that the quiet woman cheerfully flipping homemade pancakes in his bright kitchen had already meticulously orchestrated his total and absolute destruction. Back in the freezing glass mediation room, the silence was absolute. I looked at the heavy gold-plated pen resting on the polished mahogany table. I reached out, my hand perfectly steady, and picked it up. Without uttering a single word of protest, I flipped to the very last page of the incredibly thick legal document and signed my name. I legally transferred 100% of my remaining controlling shares in Ethelgard Synthetics directly into Julian's name. I completely signed over the deed to the sprawling, multi-million-dollar downtown luxury penthouse. I even signed away the title to the sleek, imported Italian sports car he loved so much. I gave him the crown, the castle, and the entire kingdom on a silver platter. Julian sat completely paralyzed for a fraction of a second, his brain desperately trying to process my sudden, total capitulation. Then, a slow, sickeningly triumphant grin spread across his handsome face. It was the exact arrogant smile of a man who genuinely believed he had just pulled off the greatest, most effortless heist of the century. Behind him, his mother let out a sharp, breathless gasp of sheer delight, aggressively clutching her expensive pearls. His sister practically vibrated with smug, unfiltered satisfaction in her chair. They exchanged deeply arrogant, knowing glances, utterly convinced that the weak, pathetic little bookworm had finally cracked under the massive pressure of the real corporate world. They truly believed I was running away, terrified and broken, exactly as they had always confidently predicted. I calmly stood up, smoothed down my skirt, politely wished them all a wonderful afternoon, and walked out of the towering glass building with the absolute lightest steps I had taken in 10 long years. The official divorce decree became legally binding exactly 3 weeks later. For 21 glorious days, Julian lived like an absolute emperor. He paraded his newly acquired, undisputed wealth around the city, openly flaunting his glamorous relationship with his wealthy heiress, firmly believing he was standing alone at the absolute pinnacle of the elite business world. He was actually hosting a lavish, fully catered victory party in the grand living room of his new penthouse when the very first hidden landmine violently detonated. It was an early Tuesday morning when the federal agents from the Environmental Protection Agency aggressively swarmed the primary manufacturing plant in Ohio. They arrived with dozens of black tactical vehicles, immediately shutting down the massive industrial facility with heavy yellow crime scene tape and severe federal injunctions. The senior executives of the chemical supply company were publicly dragged out in handcuffs for deliberately and illegally dumping highly toxic carcinogens into the local municipal water table. Within exactly 2 hours, the breaking news hit every major national financial network. Ethelgard Synthetics' entire global production line instantly froze. The critical, highly specialized chemical binding agent required to manufacture Julian's prized fabric was legally prohibited from ever being produced again. Suddenly, the revolutionary fire-resistant material that Julian had arrogantly staked his entire corporate reputation on was physically impossible to manufacture. The massive, lucrative commercial contracts he had recently secured began defaulting one by one, instantly triggering a catastrophic avalanche of massive financial penalties. While Julian was frantically screaming at his terrified corporate lawyers over the phone, desperately trying to salvage his rapidly plummeting company stock, the second meticulously planted bomb exploded directly beneath his custom Italian leather shoes. He received a massive, tightly bound legal dossier from the elite homeowners association of his prized luxury penthouse. The towering, ultra-modern building had a fatal, deeply hidden architectural flaw. The foundational concrete supports running through the lower parking structures were severely compromised, violating multiple strict city safety codes. The local government mandated an immediate, mandatory emergency structural overhaul. The total estimated cost was astronomically high, running deep into the tens of millions of dollars. Because the original property developers had conveniently declared bankruptcy several years ago, the catastrophic financial burden fell entirely and equally on the current property owners. Furthermore, the specialized hazard insurance policies absolutely refused to cover the extensive damages, officially citing pre-existing architectural negligence. By aggressively demanding sole, undisputed ownership of that breathtaking penthouse during our legal mediation, Julian had legally and permanently bound himself to a mandatory, inescapable special assessment fee of nearly $3 million, payable immediately in cold cash. His ultimate trophy home was not a luxurious palace, it was a crumbling, extremely expensive concrete trap. Desperate, bleeding cash from every single direction, and facing complete systemic ruin, Julian turned to his ultimate safety net. He ran directly to Eleanor and her massive corporate machine, Apex Dynamics. He brought the stolen, highly classified chemical blueprints, practically begging her elite board of directors to acquire his failing company and instantly bail him out of his massive, crushing debts. He confidently expected to be greeted as a conquering hero bringing the ultimate scientific prize. Instead, he walked into a freezing boardroom filled with hostile, dead-eyed corporate attorneys. Eleanor sat at the absolute head of the long wooden table, her perfectly manicured hands folded neatly together, her eyes as cold and unforgiving as polished steel. Her elite team of internal chemical engineers had ruthlessly analyzed the stolen formula. They flatly informed her that without the now banned, highly toxic Ohio binding agent, the entire proprietary blueprint was completely useless. It was absolutely nothing but a stack of very expensive, entirely worthless scrap paper. Eleanor did not just politely decline his desperate financial offer. She was a ruthless, deeply pragmatic businesswoman who fiercely protected her wealthy family's pristine public image above all else. Realizing that Julian was rapidly becoming a massive, highly toxic public relations nightmare, she completely severed all personal and professional ties. She coldly looked him directly in the eyes and explicitly informed him that their romantic engagement was permanently canceled. But she certainly did not stop there. To legally and completely distance Apex Dynamics from his rapidly sinking ship, her powerful legal department officially filed a massive corporate lawsuit against him that very same afternoon. They aggressively accused Julian of severe corporate fraud, malicious misrepresentation of intellectual property, and acting in extreme bad faith during their preliminary acquisition negotiations. The speed of his absolute total destruction was truly breathtaking to witness. His grand, invincible empire collapsed with the violent, chaotic speed of a poorly constructed house of cards, violently caught in a massive hurricane. Every single asset he had so viciously fought to rip away from me during the divorce mediation rapidly mutated into a heavy, rusted anchor chained tightly around his neck. The company he stole was entirely paralyzed and rapidly hemorrhaging money. The luxury penthouse he demanded was violently draining his personal bank accounts dry. The glamorous new fiancée he cruelly betrayed me for was actively trying to send him to federal prison. He had desperately wanted to leave me with absolutely nothing. Now, he was utterly trapped under the crushing, suffocating weight of his own monumental greed. I watched his spectacular, highly publicized financial execution unfold from afar, perfectly knowing I had simply handed him the beautiful, glittering crown he so desperately craved, laced with enough lethal poison to wipe his entire legacy off the map. The final collapse of his world was not something I watched with malicious glee. I actually felt a profound, quiet detachment. He was rapidly transitioning from an arrogant chief executive officer to a desperate criminal defendant facing multiple federal indictments for massive corporate financial fraud. In his absolute crushing desperation, he desperately tried to reach out to me. My personal phone would frequently fill with lengthy, frantic voicemails where his once smooth, intensely confident voice was entirely reduced to pathetic, weeping pleas. He begged me to publicly vouch for his character, to voluntarily absorb some of the crushing financial liability, or to at least release a sympathetic public statement defending his early contributions to the science. I never listened to them past the first few seconds. I simply forwarded every single recording directly to my lead attorney, who responded to his frantic legal team with a massive, impenetrable wall of absolute silence. His family, the very same people who had so viciously mocked my quiet nature and actively plotted my total erasure, experienced a spectacular, deeply humiliating fall from grace. The elite, high society circles of Chicago are notoriously unforgiving. When the massive financial scandal violently broke across the local news networks, his mother and sister instantly became complete social pariahs. The exclusive charity boards they desperately clung to quietly but firmly demanded their immediate resignations. They could no longer show their faces at the lavish downtown galas or the elite, sprawling country clubs without inviting sharp whispers and disgusted stares. Their highly guarded family reputation, which they prized far above basic human decency, was utterly and permanently destroyed by their own blind, gluttonous greed. They were left to sit alone in their quiet, dark house, completely suffocated by the humiliating reality of their terrible choices. But the absolute climax of this entire journey was not watching their miserable empire burn to ashes. It was the beautiful, bright morning I finally stepped completely out of the shadows. Exactly 8 months after the divorce was legally finalized, I officially launched my entirely new biomaterial brand. The heavily layered Shell Corporation formally dropped its legal disguise, and I proudly stepped forward as the sole founder and chief executive officer. We boldly introduced the Generation 2.0 synthetic fabric directly to the global market. It was an absolute, undeniable phenomenon. It was 30% lighter, vastly more durable, and entirely environmentally safe. Within the very first week of our official commercial launch, the massive manufacturing corporations that had recently fled his collapsing company frantically rushed to my doorstep. They aggressively signed massive, highly lucrative 10-year exclusive supply contracts directly with me. Standing in my bright, pristine new laboratory, surrounded by a dedicated team of brilliant scientists who looked at me with genuine, profound respect, I finally understood something incredibly important. I realized that the greatest, most satisfying revenge is never truly about watching your enemy fall into total ruin. True, lasting vengeance is the beautiful, quiet process of completely reclaiming your own absolute self-worth. It is looking directly in the mirror and finally recognizing the powerful, brilliant person you always were, permanently stripping away the heavy, suffocating labels that small-minded people desperately tried to force upon you. My personal life transformed into a beautiful, quiet sanctuary. Without the constant, exhausting weight of his fragile ego and his family's highly toxic judgment, I could finally breathe deeply again. My son and I started building completely new, wonderful traditions. Every single weekend, we pack up our durable canvas tent and drive far out into the quiet, serene forests. We build warm, crackling campfires under the vast, starry night sky. We roast marshmallows and tell silly, winding stories until we both fall asleep laughing. I no longer have to carefully shrink myself, constantly monitor my words, or fake a polite, highly submissive smile just to keep a toxic, miserable peace. I am simply a devoted mother, a brilliant scientist, and a woman who entirely owns her own magnificent life. The story always brings me back to one specific, highly emotional memory. Just the other day, I was standing quietly on the sunny downtown sidewalk, looking high up at the towering glass facade of my brand new corporate headquarters. The massive, shining silver letters of my own company logo beautifully reflected the bright morning sun. I thought back to that freezing, highly stressful mediation room. I remembered the sheer, overwhelming terror I felt when my father leaned over and calmly told me to surrender absolutely everything. Looking at my beautiful, peaceful new reality, I finally understood the profound, quiet wisdom in his 3 simple words. The very moment I became completely willing to let go of the hollow, fake illusions I had fought so hard to protect, I did not actually lose anything at all. In reality, I truly gained the entire world. Thank you so much, from the absolute bottom of my heart, for staying and listening to my story today. Where in the world are you tuning in from right now? If you enjoyed this journey and found some strength or inspiration in my experience, please consider supporting our hardworking channel with just $1. You can quickly and easily scan the PayPal QR code right on your screen, or simply use the convenient link provided in the video description or the pinned comment below. Your kind, generous support allows this wonderful team to pay for their daily lives, provide for their families, and keep producing these powerful, highly emotional stories for all of you. Have a truly wonderful, beautiful, and deeply peaceful day.